Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. It's been a super long time coming. It's I've just had very not as much time to read and much less time to even think about recording things and kind of editing them, uploading them here. I have tried to film a couple of vlogs in the past year, but that kind of fell through because things were just so incoherent in my life. I wanted to make this video mostly as a 3-in-1 kind of updating on the books that I read in the last year, kind of from August onwards, some of my favorite books from the year, and then currently what I'm reading. I am not reading that many books, honestly. I really wanted to film this wrap-up video back in January, but I was going through such a huge slump, psychological slump, that I was not out there at all. I mean, just not doing anything at all. So from the last time I updated this channel, which was back in August, I read a few more books. So shortly after, I did read this novel called The Great Reclamation by Heng. This is a book that really was published to some degree of publicity. I think a lot of people were talking about it, and a lot of people said that it was the novel of the year, or really Singaporean literature at its best. And I do know that it's gotten quite a lot of press in that manner, and I would say it is quite an incredible book. It's quite rare that I read a full-length novel like this. I would say the novel itself really was able to capture that kind of feeling of the great Singapore novel, but in a very personal tone, and I guess in a very grey area, right? It's not a black and white story where characters are good and they stay good throughout. It's not like certain characters started out as bad or backward and then eventually come out as modernized and so forth and whatever. But there were so many interesting tensions that were brought out in this novel that I felt like it is a very... I mean, the themes are not new. A lot of the themes that were explored in this book were things about modernization, globalization, development, education, really about the getting rid of the old to pay for the new. And that is a very common sentiment that you see a lot in local literature, especially in Singapore, when the country's modernization was really rapidly accelerated in its independence. Land scarcity runs as this topmost anxiety that we have in Singapore. We feel like we always have to constantly develop what we have previously into new things to keep up with the global market, to keep up with global competitiveness. There's always this anxiety of maximizing and optimizing the space that we have, because the land that we have is so little, I mean, compared to how huge we portray ourselves to be. There is a very literal plot that you can follow, but through that literal plot you can really see these little tensions and conflicts that come out between characters, but also the character's own relationship with the land. You follow this character Abun, which is it's kind of like naming someone John, in a very typical name. Someone called Abun who grows up in this kampong, much more village-like, rural-esque past of Singapore. He grows up in that kind of environment, and then he becomes someone that grows up to be very pragmatic, grows up to be part of the civil service, and you see that tension between the people that he grew up with and then the people he ultimately came to represent or to serve and all that. So it's a very interesting kind of subtle take on our political landscape as well, and I felt that it was quite cleverly done, because it isn't hey, politics is something that is so far removed from us, right? Politics is part of our everyday. Politics is that person that you grew up with who is now serving in the government. Politics is having ideologies kind of diverge as you get older, as your family has different priorities and different needs, and things just your wants and your desires kind of diverge like that, and that plays into politics as well, especially to local audiences that don't read so much. I think this is a great novel to pick up and to really invest your time in, just kind of feeling the space and feeling the story. And it's a story that I feel like a lot of people can relate to, even as Singapore today, we may not see that rapid acceleration of modernization and all. We still feel the effects of it, be it through grandparents or kind of relatives, or even through like new friends who come here and naturalize here. I mean, I'm included in that group as well. We still have this sense of migration and identity that's so rooted in our understanding of what it means to be Singaporeans. So yeah, I just think overall the writing style it's simple but nuanced, and I like that. Okay, so next, right, I would say the last two books that I read for 2023 are these two books called Welcome to Hyunam-Dong Bookshop by Hwang Bo-reum. And this is translated by one of our local literary translators, Shanna. So I'm sorry, I kind of like damaged the book a little bit here. But yeah, I picked this up at the Singapore's Writers' Fest sometime in October last year, and I did attend the Writers' Festival, though not too many of the panels, but again because I was really busy with work during that period. I think it was like September, October period where I was really swamped with a lot of programs happening. This book somehow kind of called out to me in the bookshop because I really wanted this kind of healing feeling. I don't know whether, how many of you are familiar with, say, like Korean pop culture or whatever, but there's this term called healing, which is to connote a sense of like very restful and I guess healing time, right? And this book definitely captures that feeling of healing very, very well, in a sense that this story follows this woman who quits her corporate life to start a bookshop, and she's so dedicated to the bookshop. Little characters come in here and there and also create their own life in this bookshop. And I have a romance about bookshops, of course. I mean, it's kind of obvious from the content I made. I would say this novel is really, really simple, really for like that, good for like a day, like if you have an afternoon free and you're in a cafe bookshop cafe. Ideally you just have 2 rounds of a latte with some desserts and you can finish this in one sitting. This took me about maybe 4 to 5 hours to finish reading. It was really quite straightforward, but it made me really happy. I mean, it's simple joys of life kind of book, something that I would say is a comfort read, which is not really my typical style of books that I read. This was a very welcome respite from the chaos that was in my life back then. After that, I did read the Anthropocene Cookbook, Recipes and Opportunities for Future Catastrophes by Zane, Cerpina. This book, I would say, it's a really, really random book. I found it by browsing the ebook library of my local library. This was such an interesting read because every chapter was a certain theme about the future of our food, right? So there could be a chapter that was about like what it means to have genetically modified food. How far can we push that? How far can we push kind of like lab-grown meat? What do we think about eating insects as like the primary source of protein in the future? What do we think about food waste? How do we think about technology in food waste and things like that? It was really a very kind of a thought-provoking book. This book is basically a compilation of different artists and their thought experiments when it came to like the future of food. It was such a brilliant book. I remember reading it, and at some parts I was pretty disgusted by what I read, but it was the kind of book that I felt there should be more of, in a sense that it's speculative, right? Everything in this book was speculative. There were artists that took samples from different parts of their body and took whatever culture that was on there, so for example the bacteria or the yeast culture on those parts of the bodies, and created their own cheeses or like fermented foods from it. And it kind of raised the question of how far can we push food cultivation in human society. And when you think about it, it's kind of disgusting, but when you really think about our current food systems, there are many points of disgust that we just don't see, and that kind of questions what is this idea of disgust, right? I mean, of course, we go way back. There's all these theories and discussions about cleanliness, hygiene, etc., and how that delineates between societies, different classes, etc. And all these things come together in our food, and how far we can push that in the future. So the question is like also again for us as humans, thinking about the way we think about food, thinking about the way that we process and create our foods, has very real implications, because we are now in a climate crisis and food is such a major part of that. kind of crisis and how we sustain each other, we must think of more innovative ways, right, of creating more sustainable and ethical food systems, but also for ourselves, right? I mean, what I really enjoyed about the author was that they also recognize and acknowledge that it is human instinct to want to seek out like gustatory experiences, right? We want the most interesting and mind-blowing kind of culinary experiences. We don't have to see it as contradictory things. We can see it as parallel forces. We can see them as helping each other kind of towards the direction that we want to take when it comes to like how we see our food. Fully enjoyed this book. I would say it's one of my top picks for the year. It's futures thinking, and reading this book again reminded me why it's so important to have artists in society, because literally the role of the artist is to push our ideas. It's to open up new possibilities. It's to kind of question the status quo in society, and in questioning all these things open up new horizons for ways of living. And that's why, you know, like I still really much believe in like art and artists and the whole world of just like ideas, right? I see them as the same thing. And what I really liked about the direction of the book was also how science and art were not, you know, were not on opposite ends, right? They were really like two sides of the same thing. Like you can't have art without science, and you can't have science without art. Like these two things go hand in hand. Scientific practice is also artistic practice, vice versa. Yeah, so that's kind of like the end of the books that I read in 2023. And I would say very quickly, my top picks for the year, I would choose just four. The four books are The Great Reclamation, the novel. The second is A Flat Place by Noreen Masood. I would also recommend this book called The Sounds of Life, How Digital Technology Bring Us Closer to the Worlds of Animals and Plants by Karen Baker. I would actually add the Anthropocene cookbook to this list as well. I just felt like, you know, for me, non-fiction is such a big part of my reading diet because it is really the exploration of ideas that draws me in. And I found that these books really do capture that, and especially for A Flat Place, if you're someone that enjoys memoirs and you enjoy understanding intergenerational trauma and how that plays out on in relation to landscapes as well, perfect book for you. Okay, now finally we can move on to books that I've read so far and the bigger themes that I'm exploring in the year ahead. I don't know how many of you know this, but I am working in kind of like an arts management role in Singapore. So me being me and intellectualizing my struggles, I did pick up a number of books about like arts management. This is kind of like a memoir of this person called Julianna Lim, and she was a kind of like a public servant, civil servant in the golden era, I would say, of like arts management in Singapore. So that was from the 1970s until the 2000s. In her life, she was involved in projects that included like, you know, cultural policy, arts policy, kind of supporting arts organizations in Singapore, as well as the opening of like Esplanade. I would say it's really kind of written very straightforwardly. There isn't much like oh, you know, this is what it should be like, etc. It's really from her point of view, like, okay, I did this, I did that, this happened, that happened, you know, these people met, and this was the result of their discussions, kind of writing, which I guess, you know, it makes sense, but you're not gonna get a lot of like, say, insight into the larger arts industry currently. I would say this is a good insight into how arts has been like in Singapore during that 30-year period, right? I would say for me, I am still learning a lot about like what it means to work as an arts administrator in Singapore. I wouldn't say I am fully comfortable with that position, but I would say this has been a really huge tension for me in terms of like the position between arts and the rest of society, right? As much as you have artists and you have, you know, people who are really in that groundbreaking and rule breaking and all sorts of breaking kind of environment, you must also have people who are kind of digesting it into more palatable means for the general public. It has been a very interesting learning point for me to be in that position. I always think about it in this way, in which like art always persists in human society. It's just that it takes on different forms in many different ways, and I wonder, like, you know, systems today, the way that we generate value from art, it's a very strange thing to think about. I just wanted to say that because that is still a huge theme in my life this year, as I am trying to gain more professional experience, no matter what that means. And still, like, looking back on the first few videos I made about work, I find that where I am right now is really an opposite of how I felt of like all these work systems in the past. But again, like, I want to enforce that back then I had really the luxury of time and rest to think about these ideas, and going to work now, understanding having that context is really quite jarring for me a lot of times, and I'm still trying to find a balance between like what is realistic and pragmatic, and how I can really push those ideas forward in terms of how we see work and how we see, you know, life in general. But it's still an ongoing process and it's still a struggle for me. So that's where I'm at right now. Okay, the next book I finished is this book called Allergic, Our Irritated Bodies in a Changing World by Theresa MacPhail. I read this again because I was experiencing high levels of stress and my body basically erupted in kind of like a 2-month long period of hives. It was on and off, and I just had really like red spots everywhere on my body, and I was getting allergic reactions more easily, things like runny nose or swollen eyes. So I read this book trying to understand, at least from a biological point of view, why certain allergies of mine were acting up. Again, it's my tendency to seek answers when I know the answer is not that simple. Allergies are really very complex. They're not just like an individual symptom sort of thing. They also are a symptom of like larger societal changes today. I really appreciated how the author did talk just about individual kind of level systems. Say for example how sensitive your system is and the difference between sensitivity versus allergies. Also understanding on a environmental level how invasive species in different environments have also resulted in higher levels of, say, pollen. Case studies, although were mostly based in the US, there were some examples that were taken from other countries. So there's still some effort, I guess, in trying to diversify the sample sources. But I still feel like it was quite a well-rounded book in terms of the knowledge. Even doctors themselves, like, they have different definitions of what allergies are, right? Is it a localized allergy, like only some parts of your body reacts to that allergen? Is it an internal kind of reaction, or is it just external? There's still so much that science is like unable to uncover, right? And there's all these tensions again, right, with say pharmacy companies trying to make a profit off all these, like, you know, patients that have allergies. Really quite an interesting read. I would say perfect for those who are really interested in this topic, but overall it's also not a bad book. And if you want to get deeper knowledge of allergies, I would say generally it's one of those very typical non-fiction books that's not going to really blow your mind, but is going to give you much better understanding of a particular topic. In this case, it would be allergies. I just finished these two books. The first book is How Far the Light Reaches, A Life in 10 Sea Creatures by Sabrina Imbler, and then Saving Time, Discovering a Life Beyond the Cloud by Jenny Odell. How Far the Light Reaches, this book is a book that I stumbled upon in the library, and I wasn't really expecting much about it, but then I read a little bit more about the book, and I found out that it's a book that's by a queer author, and it's part memoir, kind of part marine life, nature writing, and that was just so enchanting to me, that kind of combination. So I took my chance and I read it, and wow, it was really such a really beautiful read, very contemplative and very, like a very, I would say, reading this book felt like a really warm hug. It felt like being seen, but also like feeling bigger than what you already are. Yeah, I think it's very hard for me to explain it, but there is a lot of queerness in nature. It's really only because of human interpretation that we have created this dichotomy between like what is queer and what's not. Like, you know, what is heteronormative and what's queer. Like, if you really think about it, right, nature is this huge thing, right? It's just this really complex thing, right? It's like, it's just so massive. It's just so complicated. It's just made right because of so many years of molding and morphing together that things find their place in the ecosystem. It doesn't follow human logic. It felt like this book captured that feeling of wonder for me. It really felt like I was a kid again, like reading about nature. And I don't know whether I mentioned this before, on my channel, but when I was young, I didn't really grow up reading storybooks. I read a lot of encyclopedias. I don't know. But reading this book, I kind of understood why. I was so obsessed with nature, because in nature you see all these really beautiful and wonderful and mysterious things. I was so mesmerized by nature as a kid, and this book kind of brought me back to that. Like I feel like maybe that's why I was so interested in nature, because inherently there's this whole world in front of us that we can see ourselves in. And one of the stories, for example, was about like the goldfish, how we as humans have domesticated the goldfish in a way that we've made them live in like glass bowls with very little things, right? It's just a bowl and water and maybe like a fake plant, but they can live, and they live. But because some people have been throwing them out into like streams and lakes and all that, goldfish have taken over certain ecosystems. They have proliferated like mad. Like they're just taken over completely. And although we can read this as like a negative, kind of invasive thing, the way that the author wrote about it was to think about like how we can live in such trying times, right? What if we were given the environment to take up as much space as we wanted? What if we were allowed to grow monstrously, where previously we had no kind of sense of the future, just a glass bowl, but once you put out there, your possibility is endless. And when I read that chapter, I was so stunned. I had to really just close the book for a while and think about it, because I've never felt that interpretation before, but I could feel it. I really, really felt it, and each of the chapters had that kind of feeling for me, where, you know, this author would have encountered different sea creatures, you know, all types of marine life, and related that to this very human feeling of wanting to be seen, wanting to connect with others, wanting to be all your weird configurations, wanting to be in love, wanting to be out there in the world and experience things, the tactility of it. Like, it was such a gorgeous book, honestly, and I felt like I learned so much about the marine creatures, but also I felt like I learned so much about what it meant to see yourself in nature and to realize that the gap isn't that huge. Yeah, and I think that kind of relates to the next book that I read, which was Saving Time by Jenny Odell. To be really frank, I really had a hard time reading this book because, you know, if you've read her previous book, How to Do Nothing, it is a very similar writing style in which Jenny Odell really quotes a lot of writers and thinkers, and she really like throws names like nobody's business. Like, she's just constantly quoting other authors and writers, and I appreciate the reading list, but as a reader, it was very hard for me to get to the heart of what she was trying to say. Ultimately, overall, the ideas that she explored, questioning time and questioning how we package our time today, or how society kind of, you know, sees it in these blocks of time, and, you know, questioning ideas of time management tools, about leisure time, about, you know, even like the way that we structure time across countries. It reminds me of this artwork by Ho Zunian, who's a local artist, who recently created a new work for his exhibit at the Singapore Art Museum called T is for Time. And it's, you know, really the same thing. It's about like, he had this work where it showed like each screen showed like a different metric of time. So it could be a cat that's napping, it could be a water clock that's kind of flowing over, it could be the time that a planet takes to rotate around the sun. And for me now, looking back 2 years ago, when I had that questioning of time, and I'm glad I went through that questioning, because I think that's the kind of sentiment that Jenny Odell had throughout the book, and I can understand it. But I feel like if you've never really had that disruption of time, you wouldn't really understand why she's questioning all these things, right? You wouldn't really understand why she's making such a big fuss about the way that we construct time. But if you've been through that disruption, you would understand why it's so pivotal. And one of the reasons that she said for writing this book was that she noticed there's a gap between how we psychologically are experiencing time right now, which is, you know, the climate crisis. We see like such major disruptions in our systems. We see timelines condensing and yet stretching out at the same time. Yet simultaneously, we are working. We are following this like 9 to 5 system. All these ideas of, like, for example, crib time. If you're familiar with disability studies, you would understand that this is a conception of time that, you know, bodies of different abilities, right? How we experience the world is ultimately different. It was really tough for me to reconcile like what the book is trying to get at. How do I live that out practically? And I also find it very ironic that her book, How to Do Nothing, became such a popular book. It was slightly ironic, and I felt like people were not really getting the point that she was trying to be quite revolutionary in her ideas, but ultimately people are just going to read her writing as a kind of like time management, kind of like a self-help book, which really isn't the case, right? I would say if you liked her previous book, this book is really very similar. If you've never really read her writing before, I think How to Do Nothing would be a better place to start. Finally, I want to talk about this book. I'm still reading it. I'm like halfway through. It's called Blockchain Chicken Farm and Other Stories of Tech in China's Countryside by Xiaowei Wang. Very, very interesting book so far. It's about how like tech is being integrated into the rural areas of China, and also just understanding China as a whole. I've never really read about China in terms of like, say, its economy, its society. The author herself has a bit of a personal stake in the topics here, because I think her family, like her grandfather, still lives in China or something like that, and she still has relatives there, so she visits them and she tries to understand the villagers, and she interviews them and she writes about these anecdotes. You're meeting them, seeing how the farms are like, seeing how the tech is like, understanding what people think about the tech. Yeah, and I find this kind of topic to be really intriguing nowadays. I've never really found myself to be a very tech person, but in the past year, I've not saying that I've become someone who's optimistic about technology, but I've started to really like question my own understanding of tech. What is my stance towards technology, right? And technology is so broad. Again, there are certain infrastructures of technology that we can think about. There's also like artificial intelligence. There's also like, you know, what we consider low-tech solutions, you know, for example, for water sanitation purposes and things like that. There's all types of technology and ways of like creating information and passing information around, verification. This is something that I've been thinking a lot about in terms of like technology as a tool that I haven't really wrapped my head around, right? I still don't know what to think about it. Is it a good or a bad thing? Of course, the answer is not clear, but I think those are the things that I'm interested in. So I ran out of things to say, and yeah, I can't believe I talked this much. Thank you for sticking with me. Thank you for watching this video. And also, I did open up a PO box. If any of you are interested in sending me stuff, you can send it to my PO address below. But please don't send anything weird. Please, I trust that this is safe. Thanks so much, and I can't wait to bring more books back to you. So